Welcome everybody to your free GMAT prep hour. It is February 21st, 2021. I will be your host tonight, Reed Arnold. Welcome back. Those of you that are coming back, welcome for a first time. Those of you that are here for the first time. Hope you find something helpful tonight. These free GMAT prep hours we do once every 2 weeks or so. GMAT instructors from Manhattan Prep will jump on and teach lessons that they want to teach on major test topics and minor test topics and all sorts of test topics. You can check our library for a whole list of the recordings we've done. Have a lot of really great resources there to dig into various different GMAT topics. Okay, if you're looking for other free GMAT prep options, we have a few. You can take the first of any of our courses for free. We have a 9-week course, a 9-session course, and that first class is actually free if you want to try it out. See if you like our style, see if you like the teacher, whoever's teaching it. Do some research, find a teacher who kind of strikes your interest, and take one of their courses for free. If I'm being honest, it's over 10% of the course, and we talk about some really big stuff in session 1. So I always encourage people to do that, even if you don't intend on taking the course. Although don't tell my company I said that. It's a great resource. Really big stuff is discussed there in data sufficiency and sentence correction. So it's a good thing for you to take advantage of. You can also try our Interact course. It's our video course. You can try a sample of that for free and get a sample of what our self-study syllabus will look like. Today we are talking, well, you know what? I'm not going to tell you what we're talking about quite yet. What I want you to do is a sentence correction question. I'm going to give you all 80 seconds. That's how much time you have on average for a sentence correction question. Go ahead and go. That is 1:20. That is the average time you have for a sentence correction question. Go ahead and choose an answer if you have one. If it's a guess, you can go ahead and put a question mark by it so that I have a sense of where people are guessing in the room. Okay. So D, C, D, D, B, A, C, 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 C. Okay, C, a lot of C's, a lot of C's. A, question mark, C, C. C is getting some gravity here. Okay. For those of you that are new to the GMAT, this is kind of day one. This is a sentence correction question. There's a sentence. Some of it is underlined. Maybe all of it is underlined. And then they give you 5 answer choices, A being the same that is the underline, to choose, which one is best. And so we're going to be talking about sentence correction tonight and a specific thing about sentence correction. And I wanted to do this question here as a warm up. And what I'm going to do is actually, I'm not going to give the answer to this one yet. I would say it looks like in the room that C's getting a pretty hefty, no, not pretty hefty, but it's getting a slight favor. Looks like, what else is out there? D has a decent showing as well. A few A's and B's and E's or so, but it looks like C has the gravity. And we're going to come back to this one at the end of this lesson and see if we get a more consensus in the answer that we choose. Before we do that, I want you to take a look at these sentences. And I want you to tell me which of these you think is grammatically correct. Just take a minute or two to look through these. This is not like the test, but this helps introduce today's topic. So someone is saying in the chat, these make me feel like I did not know English whatsoever. Some are saying the second is okay. Some are saying the fourth is okay. Some are saying only the fourth is okay. Some are saying the fifth is okay. Someone said, are they missing verbs? Someone said the fifth, fourth only, fifth, the second. All of these sentences are perfectly okay. Every single one of them is a perfectly grammatical sentence that has a clear and unambiguous meaning. How? How could that possibly be the case? These are called garden path sentences. And you can look that term up and figure out what exactly that means. But we're going to use them as an example to introduce today's topic, because today we are talking about how sentences are built. And sentences are built, I've determined after several years of teaching this, there are three primary parts of sentence structure that you want to start looking out for. Sentence structure is the biggest thing to learn in sentence correction. How sentences are built, how sentences are constructed. I would say, this is not scientific, but I would say 75, 80% of sentence correction is getting really good at sentence structure. And when you get really good at it, all sorts of other things start to just fall into place. Parallelism, comparisons, there's all sorts of things that tie just to like how are sentences put together. And I don't know pure like grammar. I don't know the pure words. I'm sure today, if a real grammarian, grammatist, someone who like really loves grammar watches this video, I'll probably make them shudder. But for the purposes of the GMAT, I know what we need to know about grammar. Okay, and I've determined for now, and it's always subject to change. You always find new ways of teaching things, but I've determined for now that there are three primary parts of sentence structure. These are the three things you need to look out for. And I'm kind of cheating on the first one because I'm putting two in there, but that's okay. The first, the major thing to look out for are the subjects and verbs of a sentence. The second major part of sentence structure are the conjunctions and the major punctuation that join parts of a sentence together. And the third big thing to look out for in sentence structure is modifiers. Okay, these are the three parts of sentence structure. And when you're trying to figure out how a sentence works, you're looking for these three things. We've talked about sentence structure before, by the way. You'll see you will see it talked about in many of the free GMAT prep hours. I did something on parallel structure, which is going to have some similarities to sentence structure if you look up everything you could learn about parallelism. But I wanted this to be kind of a all-encompassing one-stop shop for how to think about structure at the first, most basic, highest level. And I do think, again, this will cover a huge amount of sentence correction questions. Okay, subjects and verbs. Okay, subjects are nouns or noun phrases that do a verb in the sentence. They do an action. The verb is the action that the subjects do. We have to be very careful about verbs and modifiers because they often interchange and look alike. That might be part of the reason those sentences we just looked at are so confusing, which we'll go back to in a moment and look at those and figure out how they could possibly all be right. And I say noun phrase. One thing I want to get past, and I would encourage you all to get past when you're thinking about sentence structure, is not one word at a time thinking. Clumps of words do jobs in a sentence. And one of the things you're thinking about when you're thinking about sentence structure is what clump of words is achieving what job. And within that clump of words, there might be subclumps that are doing their own job within the clump. But we want to get past just the like single word diagnoses. I think there are words that can help guide you, and certainly some words tell you what a clump of words is about to do. But sometimes it's helpful to think about multiple words as one thing. For instance, in the sentence, let's just give an example of what I kind of mean by this. In the sentence, he has driven 1,000 miles today. Right? I think I don't know for sure, but I think in like pure grammar, the verb is has, and driven is like it's a participle that because it's with the word has becomes like part of the verb, and I don't know. I call that whole thing a verb. He has driven. Has driven is the verb. And in fact, I might even go so far as to say has driven 1,000 miles is the verb. Like that whole clump of words is the action. Now, again, in pure grammar, that's not the case. 1,000 miles is probably what we would call the object of the verb, and 1,000 is a modifier describing how many miles there are. Like that's the subclump. But for my purpose, it's just like, well, let's just lump that together. That's the action. He has driven 1,000 miles, and then today is modifying when that happened. Okay. So think about how clumps of words do a job. Conjunctions join clumps of words together. They either join full clauses together, subject verb clauses, or they join words in parallel structure. Again, I have a whole video on parallelism. You can look that up. Major punctuation is punctuation, usually commas and semicolons, that helps separate out a sentence's parts, help you maybe see the structure a little easier, and are sometimes necessary. For instance, you need a semicolon between independent clauses if they are independent clauses. And last but not least are modifiers. And again, there are words, and they're often huge clumps of words that are adding detail and information to the sentence, but are not part of what we sometimes call the core of the sentence or the main skeleton of a sentence. It's helpful to recognize where they are, but a lot of times when you're thinking about structure, you recognize where they are so that you kind of cannot pay attention to them for a second. Okay, but these are the three things that make up sentence structure. So let's go back to these sentences here. And let's talk about where we find those things. Well, where do we have subjects and verbs? I have here the dog. And I can tell that that's the subject of the sentence. I'm talking about the dog. I would like to use red for subjects today. Red will be subjects, blue will be conjunctions and punctuations, and green will be modifiers. And it's first things like the dog walked. That's the action. The dog walked past the barn fell. Wait, did the barn fall? Like if this is a grammatically correct sentence, I would need a semicolon. The dog walked past, comma, the barn fell, or something like that. I don't, something doesn't work here. But if I stop thinking about walked as a verb and think of it instead as a modifier, as in the dog that was walked past the barn fell. And then the subject is the subject verb is the dog fell. And we describe the dog as walked past the barn. That is not the most common use of the word walked, but it's not wrong. Your dog was walked, right? You walk a dog was walked. So the dog walked past the barn fell. Okay. The complex houses married in single soldiers. Well, your first instinct on this sentence might be, okay, complex is describing the houses, the complicated houses, and the complicated houses married somebody. They married and is this a person? Did the houses marry someone named and single soldier? No, of course not. This sentence is structured differently. Complex is not a modifier. Complex is a noun. Houses is not a noun. Houses is a verb. Married is not a verb. Married is a modifier. Married and single soldiers. Okay. And you could maybe, if you want, you could say this whole thing. The complex, what does the complex do? Houses soldiers. What kind of soldiers? Married and single soldiers. Someone asked, do we need commas? We need no commas so far. In fact, commas would be wrong to tell for these sentences here. Okay. When to use a modifier like verbed versus a modifier verbing depends on the sentence. JD, there's a if I say the dog walking past the barn, that means the dog, like it's describing the dog that's currently walking past the barn. If I say the dog walked past the barn, that means someone walked the dog past in the past or recent past. You could say the dog that is being walked past the barn if you want to make it very present. Okay. The old man, the boats. Again, old feels like a modifier. But it's not. In this case, old means like the old people, the elderly. Man is the verb, and they man the boats. The boats is the object. The old man the boats. This last one is, these last two are fun. They're very similar. Is old a collective noun? Maria, I don't know. I don't know words. I don't know terms. Probably. I think that sounds right. If a collective noun is like a noun that stands for many individual things, then yes. Like people, the old people man the boats. This last one is tricky because it's like, okay, well, that is describing exercise. That exercise, meaning that particular exercise, can be harmful. And then we describe how it's harmful to joints, and conjunction should be done. And then we modify how it should be done. Okay. But then we have this last thing, is obvious. Wait, what is obvious? Is a spirit of caution obvious? Or joints and ligaments? Oh, that doesn't make sense. This sentence has a weird subject. And the weird subject is the word that. That has many weird uses. This is one of them. And the word that is the subject. And then we have like that what, meaning that. And then we have this little clause, exercise can be harmful and should be done with a spirit of caution. Is obvious. And that's the main verb. That is obvious. Well, what is obvious? That exercise can be harmful and should be done with caution. You can think of this like the fact that exercise. Whereas down here, that is used as you might usually think it. That exercise, meaning that particular exercise, can be harmful to joints and ligaments and should be done with extreme caution, being the modifier. Highlight our conjunctions as well here. Now, I'd actually say this last one, while grammatically correct, is probably the meaning is wrong. What is an obvious spirit of caution? I don't think that really makes sense, but it's not grammatically wrong. Okay. Has a different subject though. The subject in that second sentence is, the main subject is exercise. And in the first sentence, the main subject is that exercise can be harmful. That is a Greek name I cannot pronounce because I do not know how to read Greek, but they ask, when we see that starting a sentence, is it most likely the subject? Yeah, probably. Because the GMAT, you're not going to have, like when we say that dog over there, we have like a reference point in the real world. In the GMAT, you just have the sentence. And so it's hard to have the reference in just a sentence. So if you see that at the start of the sentence, yeah, it's probably a subject. And it means the fact that whatever clause follows is something. No, JD, the subject is that. And then we have the clause that's really like describing that. I don't know if it's a modifier or not. Again, I don't know real terms. I'm sure there's a word for what all these things are. That is the subject, and it's, yes, JD, that is the subject, and it captures the idea of the clause that follows. And again, maybe you can think of the clause that follows as describing what that is. I don't know what the words are. Okay, it's a weird example, but I've seen sentences like this on the GMAT for sure. The verb in the last sentence would be can be harmful and should be done. Those are the verbs in this last sentence. So today, this is our job. This is what we're going to do all day now. We've laid out the lesson, frankly. Now it's just a game of finding subjects, verbs, and modifiers. And this is what you want to practice. We won't become an absolute bloodhound so that you see subjects, verbs, and modifiers and can find the sentence structure. You want to do it soon, quickly, automatically, right? Now, you want to be able to do it quickly. You might not be able to do it soon because it takes practice to see sentences like this. But the thing I also wanted to point out on these, notice that the word at the end of the sentence, like structure is not determined until the sentence is over. And a word at the end of the sentence can totally change the structure of the sentence before. If this word isn't here, if I just say the dog walked past the barn, structure, subject, verb, the dog walked, modifier, past the barn. Okay, but words late in the sentence can have dramatic impact on the role of words previously in the sentence. That's why these are called garden path sentences, because it's like you're walking a garden path and you get lost and you got to walk back and figure out how the heck the sentence is built. Some of these are much trickier than what the GMAT will do, I think this one is a pretty realistic GMAT sentence, quite frankly. But they do things like this. They interchange words that are verbs in some sentences and words that look like verbs. They interchange words that are nouns that could be verbs. Like they mix it all up. So you have to parse the structure of the sentence. And so that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about finding structure and how to use that. And then at the end of the day, we're actually going to talk about how this kind of thinking is actually helpful on certain quant questions. We'll see a quant question where I think this style of thinking is helpful. JDeep, so how did I know the subject of the last sentence was exercise? Well, again, it seems like it will be exercise. That exercise can be harmful, right? Meaning like that particular exercise can be harmful. The only reason it's not the subject here is because this end of the sentence is obvious. Okay, and I might take this out just for this. Oh, I can't take it out. I can do this. Take out that false, weird, obvious modifier there. That exercise can be harmful, right? Can be harmful is a verb. Should be done is a verb. What subject? What are the verbs that can be harmful and should be done? Exercise. That is the thing that does the verb. Okay, so with this in mind, I want you to take a look at these two sentences. And I'm going to give you a minute or so, a minute and a half. I want you to think about how these two sentences have anything in common. What do these two sentences have in common? One of them is, as long as a paragraph. One is very short. Well, they don't both show well, I guess there's a contrast in the first between off-Broadway shows and Broadway shows, big budget competitors. Neither of them have an opening modifier, not technically. I think I know why you're saying that, but neither of them actually start with an opening modifier. They have an identical core structure. So JDeep, yeah, one of them is although XY, and else got two clauses. One says although XY, the other says because XY. But they set up this, they have an identical core structure if we look at the elements of a sentence, okay? They both start out with what are actually conjunctions. Because is a conjunction, although is a conjunction, okay? Then we get some subject, because off-Broadway plays, and then we have some modifier, crud, have lower costs, and then we have some details about how they're lower costs, and then we have some details about why they have lower costs. It is a clause, right? We have the productions are smaller and use up-and-coming talent, right? Like we have a little clause within those dashes. But all those parts here, staged in theaters that seat fewer than 200 people, you can call this it's a comparison or a description, I don't know, but it's saying how they have lower cost or what they have lower cost than. And then we have this whole thing, which really itself is a modifier. It's describing how they have lower costs. Their productions are smaller. They use up-and-coming talent rather than seasoned veterans. Within that modifying structure, there is a core, right? The thing about clumps of words is you can have subclumps. That clump of words is meant to describe how they have lower cost. Within that clump of words, we have an idea that the productions are smaller and use this thing. But that clause is part of a modifying clump. And then we have a new subject, off-Broadway plays have a higher average return on investment. And so the core of this sentence is actually conjunction, subject, verb, comma, subject, verb. And you might notice that that's actually very similar to the situation down here. Although Laura is tall, she does not play basketball. And again, I'm putting all those words together, even though like she does not play is the verb and basketball is the object, whatever. Does not play basketball, that's the whole verb for now. Right? And like is tall, well, is tall a modifier of her? Yeah, sure, but also it's describing, it's just like it's what she is. And so this also has a similar structure when you get to the core. Conjunction, subject, verb, subject, verb. I sometimes call this kind of idea the skeleton of the sentence, or the core of the sentence. But I actually have students sometimes write out the skeleton, meaning instead of you writing the words, write conjunction, subject, verb. Now I could say for this first one, if I want, I could say conjunction, subject, and then you could say modifier, verb, comparison modifier. And then you could say like dash, clause modifier, close dash, subject, verb. That's the core structure here if we include modifiers. But modifiers, again, one of the purpose to see them for when you're thinking about big sentence structure stuff, one of the first reasons to see them is to ignore them, to make sure the sentence is built well. Questions deal with modifiers. You'll have to bring them back in and look at them. And sometimes you'll have to look at the subclump within a modifying clump to make sure it's correct. That does happen. But if you can get good at seeing the big stuff first, then when you need to zoom in, it's the same game, it's just smaller, right? But if you get good at big structure, you can look at the structure within a structure, and it's the same game. So for the purposes of main structure, like we can look through the modifiers for a second, and we're left with conjunction, subject, verb in both sentences. Conjunctions are words that do joining. You do want to notice them. And if we're joining stuff together, we have to have a conjunction. Well, we don't have to. We have a few options. We have to use a conjunction or a semicolon if we're joining clauses. You can't just put clauses together. You can't just put a comma between them. You either need to set up with what is called a subordinating conjunction, or you can use a comma fanboys conjunction, comma and, for instance. Other words that do conjunction jobs would be if is a hypothetical conjunction. That, the word that, as we saw earlier, it has a lot of jobs. One thing it kind of does sometimes is like modifier conjunction, right? The dog that I love is brown. That I love, that has a clause in it. I love that, the dog. And it's describing the dog. So you can have like it does a weird dual role there. That is a big word in structure. You might have noticed already. Yes, JD, if you're asking about the previous slide, that is correct. Words that are not conjunctions, that feel like conjunctions, just so you know these as well. However, nevertheless, thus, consequently, therefore, these are not conjunctions. Aaron is asking why they aren't conjunctions. There's no answer to that except that they aren't. If I want to say she is tall, however, she does not play basketball, Moreover, yeah, that is also not a conjunction. Moreover. That's not going to work. I have to say she is tall, semicolon, however, and sometimes you might have a however, comma, she does not play basketball. I can't just use however. I don't know why, that's just them's the rules. JD, if you're asking if something describes the clause or the verb, those are the same thing. If you describe the clause, you describe how the verb is done by the subject. So it's the same idea. Accordingly would not be a conjunction. That would be another one of these words. I think these are technically adverbs. Again, I don't know. So take a look at these sentences here. And I know you all don't have highlighting power like I do, but I want you to imagine that you did. And I want you to think about, okay, red is for subjects and verbs. For subjects and verbs. Blue is for major conjunctions and conjunctions and major punctuation. And green is for major modifying clumps. Okay, I want you to go through this and I want you to think about where you would highlight. And I would advocate that those of you that struggle with sentence structure and seeing this stuff is not easy with you yet, get colored pencils. Start with 3. Red for subjects and verbs, blue for conjunctions and punctuation, and green for modifiers. And start taking sentences in the official guide, and we'll do this a little bit later, and start cutting them up and start seeing where you would color which things. And there's some wiggle room. There's not one objective answer to all of this, but there are some good ways to cut up sentences and to see what words you clump together and which words within that clump you describe as a modifier or whatever it is. But start cutting up sentences using colors, pencils. And then when you're in the test and you don't have these tools available to you, you could still, like if you did need to do it, you could, right? The more you practice this, the quicker you're going to see where you could structure a sentence into these 3 chunks. So take your 3-4 minutes and look at these sentences and see where you would highlight things as red, things as blue, or things as green. All right. So we're back. For this first sentence here, the subject, we have a few. The main subject would be, you could, like, I'm impartial. You can call it the omnipresent threat of dehydration if you want. And then, within that, you can say that of dehydration is a modifier and omnipresent is a modifier of the threat. You can do that. Or if you just want to say, the threat, and then put the modifiers on the side. I'm fine with either. Either works. Again, there's not one right way to do this. Okay, then we have the threat, and then we have this like modifier conjunction, because that is what the word that does here. It describes what threat of dehydration we're talking about. That subject, desert reptiles face, and that's set apart. I think you could highlight maybe the whole thing if you wanted to. Again, like would you highlight all of it, or would you highlight just the word? There's no right answer to that. It's just the goal is that you see it, that you see that this chunk of words is doing that job. Okay. Is caused by, there's a new verb. And again, you could say is caused by, and then the rest is modifier, or you could say the whole thing. I don't really care. Is caused by the environment, and then put this as the dry and hot as modifier. Whatever. But the point is you're seeing what these chunks of words are doing. Okay. The exact mechanics are unknown. And again, if you want to put of the process in color green, that's fine. Up to you if you want to fold it into the subject noun phrase, if you want to do this, or if you want to do this. I'm impartial as long as you see what those words are doing. They're there to describe mechanics. And those mechanics are unknown, but it's not modifying, that desert reptiles is modifying the threat of dehydration, not dehydration itself. And so that's why it might be helpful to think of like that whole noun phrase, the threat of dehydration. That's one big threat. Within that, we have a modifier of dehydration specifying the threat. And then that noun phrase is the thing desert reptiles face. In this next sentence, the mechanics are unknown, but subjects, most geologists believe, verb. That is like one of those conjunction words that it's going to tell us what the geologists believe. Oil and gas migrate. You can put it as a modifier, or you can put it as the verb. I'm impartial. This is describing oil and gas. This is describing how they migrate. And there's a conjunction here, right? There is a parallelism building conjunction in that modifier, because it's the two ways that oil and gas migrate underground, maybe. But notice every part of the sentence is either red, blue, or green. And I can't say there aren't some weird exceptions to that, but like that's pretty common. And you want to be able to see where the red, blue, and green would be if you had the tools to highlight red, blue, and green on the test. Most psychologists believe, subject, verb, and again, there's this weird like verb conjunction, that subject, changing one's mind. That whole thing is now the subject. Verb is difficult. And then why it's verb, why it's difficult, the modifier due to a phenomenon called the blowback effect. One big, large modifying chunk, but conjunction. That, parallel to what the first that is doing, one can avoid that trap. And again, do I want to look and say, okay, well, psychological trap, that's describing the trap. Okay. That, in this case, is a reference pronoun saying that trap, meaning the blowback effect. This is a modifier referring to the blowback effect. Okay. Next sentence here, often considered a word, like all this is modifier, it's describing something. If I needed to zoom in, for some reason, because the question dealt with this modifier, I could zoom in and say, like, okay, well, that transcends its medium, is describing the work of true artistic genius and beauty, and that modifier and is joining these two modifiers. And the whole modifier of, it's a work of these things. So we have like a work of beauty that transcends its medium. We have all these modifiers modifying things there. But as a whole, it's describing the subject, Bill Watterson's Calvin and Hobbes. Modifier stuff dealt with deeper subjects. Then waxing a pub, modifier, 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 modifier. So much modifier. Little conjunction in the modifier, sure. Okay. This last quote you might have recognized as Shakespeare. That which we call a rose, that's the subject. And do you want to say like that? You want to say which we call a rose is a modifier? Sure, I'm not going to fight you on it. By another name is describing the rose. But that which we call a rose would smell as sweet. That's the verb. Semicolon, conjunction, so, subject, Romeo would retain that dear perfection. Modifier, which he owes without that title. And this is kind of a, I mean, this is Shakespearean, so it gets a little poetic here, but this is like if he were not called Romeo. And so this is there is an unspoken conjunction here, which I wouldn't expect you to realize, because this is, again, not pure. The GMAT would never use a sentence like this. I just did this one for fun. But were he not Romeo called? Were he not called Romeo? It's a little bit backwards here. So Andrea is asking, can you comment on the position of the modifiers in relation to the subject? What do you want me to comment on there? We start with an opening modifier that's describing Calvin and Hobbes. Then we give a modifier saying what Calvin and Hobbes is. Then we get the verb dealt with deeper subjects. So JD, the core of that sentence is Calvin and Hobbes dealt with deeper subjects. And then if you like than this stuff, if you want to call this whole thing the core, I think you can. Again, I'm not picky here. I also didn't include comparisons for today, although comparisons are such a weird thing. There's a free GMAT prep hour on comparisons fairly recently, actually. I feel like we've been a little sentence correction heavy lately. Probably need to take a break from this for a while. But comparisons are their own thing. And eventually when you get good at seeing these three things, you can start bring a color in for comparisons, have orange for comparisons. You can start bringing colors for parallel structure if you want. But for now, I focus on these three things. Okay. Yeah, Kelsey, I think it's like a modifying clause. It's a hypothetical. I mean, it's really a hypothetical clause if he were not called Romeo, which is not really a modifier. And the if is not there because it's Shakespeare and he broke rules all the time. So I don't think it's technically a modifier, but it's very simple. You can think of it as, this clause about Romeo. If Romeo were not called Romeo, Romeo would retain that dear perfection. Okay, so let's do some sentences. Let's do some actual sentences and see how this applies to actual questions here. Okay, so what I want you to do first is just try to do the sentence. So I'm going to give you 80 seconds to answer the question, and then we're going to talk about how seeing structure should help you get through the sentence quickly and correctly. would it usually be structured this way? Main subject between the modifier clauses. So not two modifiers in a row. Yes, this is very common. I think you're asking Andrea about this. And you said modifier clauses. These are not clauses. This first green highlight is not a clause. It does not have a subject and a verb. It's just description. A comic strip featuring a young boy is not a clause. Featuring, like a comic strip featuring a rambunctious young boy and his tiger, is describing the comic strip, but it's not a verb. Featuring comes from a verb. It is not a verb. One of the biggest things in structure is to start recognizing where things are verbs and where they are words that come from verbs but aren't, usually a modifier. And this is totally common. Modifier, subject, modifier, verb, totally common. So take 80 seconds here for this problem. Make your best guess, and we'll show how seeing structure can help get through it quickly. That's a minute 20. I have E, E, A, D, E, E, A or D, D, E, B. Okay, final guesses. Kind of a shotgun spread here. It seems like no winner here. A lot of spread out answer choices. I've highlighted what the first part of the sentence is. We have although, conjunction, subject, the economy, description, has seen a downturn in recent years. So we have although economy has seen a downturn, subject, verb. Then we start the part that matters for this underline here. And the part at the end of the sentence signify that, and that's one of those like conjunction words. And like we don't need to worry too much about what comes after that. The region could see a bullish recovery. The region, subject, could see a bullish recovery, verb, in the next decade, modifier. I'm really interested, the underline kind of stands alone. What comes before and after are full, complete thoughts, signify that. Notice this change in verbs at the end of the underline, signify versus signifies. There are a few signs that structure is tested. A long sentence, long underline is usually sentence structure. Verbs changing from singular to plural is sentence structure. Verbs changing from verbs to modifiers that look like verbs means sentence structure, or nouns that look like verbs. All of that means sentence structure. So if we look at the core of the sentence, ambitious plans, and again, if you want to highlight plans and then highlight the rest in green, I'm not going to fight you. There's no one right way to do this, but there are wrong ways to do it. Okay, discussed at several symposiums. That's all modifier, and conjunction. Trade agreements seems like a subject. These plans and trade agreements negotiated. This is description. Negotiated by previously quarreling nations signify. So the plans and trade agreements signify something. I'm muted. No, I'm not. You can hear me, right? I just got a notification that I'm muted. Okay, you lie, Zoom. That's so confusing. Now I'm worried I'm not recording. Am I recording? Is everything good? Okay, recording is good. Gosh, Zoom is always the wonderful world of Zoom that we live in. Okay, so that seems to work fine. The plans and the trade agreement signify. Well, what's the structure of some of these other answer choices? The plans, and again, if you want to highlight the modifiers within there, I'm not going to fight you on it. These plans discussed at several symposiums in the last month, and conjunction, subject, the recent negotiation, modifier of trade agreements, yada, 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 yada. And what you might do is you might say of trade agreements, and you could highlight this whole in red to keep it as one noun phrase, because those are the trade agreements that, so it's a negotiation of trade agreements, and it's a negotiation of trade agreements by previously quarreling nations, just to get what this modifier is actually describing. It's describing the negotiation of trade agreements. But here's a problem here. The plans and the negotiation signifies. That's a singular subject and a plural, singular verb and a plural subject. It's not going to work. Okay, for the sake of time here, I'm just going to highlight the subjects and verbs because that ends up being the key to this. The plans and nations signifies. Plural subject, singular verb. The discussion and the negotiation. And so it's a discussion of infrastructure, right? We then modify what it's a discussion of, but it's a discussion and a negotiation, and that's plural. Those are two things. Singular verb signifies. That's wrong. The last one, the discussion, oops. But then we actually have pure modifiers. It's a discussion of infrastructure investment plays at symposiums in the last month and of trade agreements done by previously quarreling nations. That's all description of the discussion. It's a singular subject. The discussion signify, nope, gone. It's got to be A. It's the only one that has good structure. In C is the plural subject because of nations specifically. No, plans is also plural. Plans and nations. We have two plural nouns. The plans and the nations signifies. That's the core of the sentence. We have a bunch of modifier around it, but it's the plans and nations signifies. No good. Okay, so that's A. Let's do yeah, JD, that's what happens when you have a plural subject, a plural noun joined with a singular noun. You go with the one that's closest to the verb. The GMAT, I've never seen the GMAT deal with that. And that's not the situation here. These are two plural nouns, the plans and, well, also the boys and this girl, that would be plural. The boys and this girl are bad. If I say either the boys or this girl is bad. But again, the GMAT doesn't deal with that. Let's do this one real quick. This one kind of is an interesting substructure. I'm gonna go a little bit long because I want to get through some stuff here. So take 80 seconds and try this question here. It's a minute 20. So I wanted to do this one because it's a good example of, okay, the core structure is actually outside the underline, well outside the underline. The outside the underline, we have Joan Philkill attended meetings and reviewed applications. We have a full clause. That's all there. This whole first part is a description. And so I wanted to show today how this clump of words, okay, the question is asking about this clump of words, this description of Joan. And so I want to show how you can do structures within a substructure, right? When you see the big structure, you can then zoom into the substructure. I have as the former chair, okay, she's the chair of the planning committee for 18 consecutive years and a board member for 28 years. How long she, so this tells me how long she was a board member, right? This is describing the board member. This is described, that's how long she was a board member. So this is describing how long she was something else. Well, what is that? Well, it's going to be this chunk of words. She was something for 18 consecutive years. Well, was she the former chair for 18 years? Like former is a description itself. It's a little single word describing chair. So am I saying she was the former chair for 18 years? Like she was the chair and then someone else was the chair for 18 years. And so she was the former chair while that next person was chair. And then the next person took over and she was no longer the former chair anymore. That's not wrong, but I don't think that's the story. Why? Because I'm a person and I know what the story is. The point is she did these things as the chair and she did these things as a board member. And so E is the correct answer here. It's not grammatically wrong. It's just, I don't think I'm trying to say she was a former chair for 18 years. She did all this stuff as the chair and as a board member. And so the answer is E. But you have to really think about meaning, and you also have to look into the substructure. What words are describing what things? What is for 18 years describing? It's describing how long Joan was something. Okay. This is a hard question. But she was the chair for 18 years, not a former chair for 18 consecutive years. So you can do structure into a substructure. Okay. Let's do the honeybee. Where's my honeybee question? Yeah, let's do this one here. So I'm going to give 80 seconds for this one, and then we'll discuss. It's 80 seconds. Okay. So as the honeybee's stinger is barbed, staying where it is inserted. This is a conjunction. This results in is the verb. This is a new clause. This results in the act of stinging causing, right? We have this whole chunk of stuff, what this results in. The act of stinging causing the bee to sustain a fatal injury. Well, what is this? What noun is this? As the bee stinger is barbed. So like as this is happening, this results in. That doesn't make sense. Okay. As the heavily barbed stinger stays where it is inserted. So as this is true, with the result that modifier. Well, so what does this conjunction conjoin? Nothing. As the stinger stays where it's inserted, with the result, like it doesn't finish the thought. We need to say as subject verb, comma, subject verb. We have as subject verb modifier. That's a bad skeleton. C, the honeybee's stinger results in the fact that it's one of those modifier conjunctions. But hold up, the stinger doesn't result in the fact. We modify the stinger with heavily barbed and staying where it's inserted. But the stinger doesn't result in the fact. That doesn't work. D, the heavily barbed stinger. And again, if you want to put of the honeybee in that and whatever, is of the honeybee is a modifier of the stinger. Verb stays where it is inserted. And results, subject, verb, or conjunction, verb. Okay, but again, the heavily barbed stinger doesn't result in the act of stinging causing, the thing that results in the act of stinging causing the bee to sustain an injury is that the stinger stays where it is. And so I have to choose E. The honeybee's stinger, is heavily barbed and stays where it is inserted. And again, there are modifiers within these clumps, right? I could say heavily barbed is a modifier if I so choose, but for the sake of structure, I'm just going to lump it all together as the verb. And then with the result that the act of stinging is technically like, again, this, I could get in this and say like, okay, the act of stinging causes. I have a subject verb within this modifying clump, but at the highest level, it's a modifying clump describing, this thing happens with the result that, so this thing happens with the result that is modifying that thing happening, results in the act of stinging results that the act of stinging causes the bee to die. Okay, that's correct. Has to be E. L, I don't know what those are. You're asking if it's in a positive or an absolute phrase. I don't know. That sounds like grammar words to me. But based on, this is a probably high 600 level question. I don't know exactly. Okay. So again, it's how the words clump together and what job they're doing. There are 3 jobs, most common. It's either a noun, it's part of the verb, or it's either a subject, it's part of the verb, it's a conjunction, or it's a modifying clump. JD, I don't understand your question. B stinger is heavily barbed, and B stinger stays where it is inserted. Is barbed is a verb, stays where it is inserted is a verb. The stinger does this verb, is heavily barbed, and does this verb, stays. Perfect parallel structure. We're going to take a quick diversion, and I'm going to talk about how you can use this skill in other ways. So let's take a second here and read this quant question. Give you 30 seconds to a minute or so, and we'll talk about how we can use what we're learning in sentence correction to sometimes do difficult quant. Okay. So this is a complicated word question. Before being simplified, the instructions for computing income tax in country R were to add 2% of one's annual income to the average arithmetic mean of 100 units of country R's currency and 1% of one's annual income. What? What? Get out of here. That's so much stuff. Same idea. What job are the words doing? Okay. So before being simplified is a modifier. We can worry about that. The instructions were to. So in the past, the instructions to calculate income tax were to add. Okay, so the instructions were to add 2% of one's annual income. And in some ways, this is all the verb to the average of 100 units. Like this is all what the instructions are. The instructions were to do this thing. Okay, but let's break this down a little bit further. We're to add 2% of one's annual income to the average of 100 units of the currency and 1% of one's annual income. So I'm to add 2% of one's annual income to the average of these two things. So 100 units of currency is 100 units of currency plus 1% of income is my income divided by 50. But I'm averaging those two, so I divide it by 2. And I'm supposed to add to that 2% of one's annual income. Well, that's I divided by 25. Wait, I feel like I'm doing this wrong. 1%, sorry, this is 100, not 50. I divided by 100, 1% of the income is I over 100. And 2% of the income is I over 50. So I take 2% of my income, I add that to an average of two things. What are those two things, right? Well, it's part of a big description phrase of 100 units of country R's currency and 1% of one's annual income. And again, there's like a lot like of one's annual income is describing the 1%. Units of the currency is describing what the 100 units are. There's modifiers within the modifier. But by breaking down the clumps of the words, I can build the formula, this hellish formula to calculate income tax. Okay. So it's not just sentence correction that this shows up. This kind of thing shows up in other parts as well. So, having had this discussion, let's bring this full circle. Try this one again. Let's see if we have an I for how sentences are built. Let's see if we can get some more unanimity on the answer choice. So forget what you chose before, because it might not have been correct. Try to implement today's lesson. It's a minute 20. Minute 40. I have a B and a C. Another B, another C, another B, a D, another B. It's 2 minutes. Another C. Final guesses. Another B. Okay. I might be wrong. I'll have to go back to the video, but I don't remember a lot of B's last time. I'll have to check. I don't think there were a lot of B's when we first did this. There were a lot of C's. And there still are some C's, but I'm getting a lot more B. And that implies to me that you all have gotten better at structure, because B is the correct answer. Why? Well, we have this first clause. Because intake is only one factor, right? Clause. Because this thing, new subject, new verb, over-reliance. And then we describe over-reliance on what? On marketing websites. But then we keep describing the marketing websites as recommending that people focus primarily on counting calories. So this whole chunk of text is a sub-modifier describing the websites. The websites is describing what the over-reliance is on. And so we have the over-reliance diminish someone's ability to achieve certain weight loss, yada, yada, yada. Modifier, 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 modifier. But hold up, over-reliance diminish, that's wrong. That's a singular subject and a plural verb. We need over-reliance is diminishing, is diminishing. All the other diminishings are wrong. Over-reliance diminish? No. Over-reliance diminish? No. Over-reliance are diminishing? No. It's either B or E, just by recognizing that this is the subject of a new clause and it needs a singular verb, and that whole chunk of crud is modifier describing the over-reliance, and we need the over-reliance to diminish something, so over-reliance is diminishing. And it needs to be over-reliance on marketing websites recommending over to recommend. That's just the wrong modifier. I'm impartial, like that recommend is not wrong. I'm okay with that. C is wrong because of this, not because of this. That's fine. I even kind of like that one better, but B is the best. And I had about half the answers were B this time, and I don't think it was that popular on the first time around. So this is the value of structure, seeing what the clumps of words are doing. Again, there are 3 parts: subjects and verbs, conjunctions and major punctuation, modifying chunks. Get really good at finding all 3, and you're going to be light years better on sentence correction. Okay. I will now stick around for 10 minutes to talk to the students who are here. If you're watching the recording, thank you for coming on in. If there's any questions, please leave a comment. Go ahead and quote unquote smash that like button does us a world of good. And please come back. We'd love to see you at our next free GMAT prep hour. All right. Best of luck in your studies. I think this recording will still work. So I got asked to do another question, and this is one I wanted to do. So this is a bonus question if you're still around. This is adapted from one of the hardest questions I know, and I wanted to just show how our discussion today will help with this. So if you're doing this at home, go ahead and pause the video now, because I'm not going to record the whole 80 seconds because I'm going to be answering questions for students. But go ahead, pause the video, try to do it your best, and then I'll come back on and explain what the right answer is and why, and how our discussion today helps. Okay, so hopefully you paused and took a stab at this very hard sentence correction question. Votes in the room for those that are around. Looked like A had the most votes, C had a vote or two. And the answer here is C. And this is super, super tricky because this question has its weird sentence structure, and it's also a weird comparison. And comparisons are kind of a nightmare and have their own structure games that go on. But let's think about where the main parts of the sentence are. First off, in no other game, that's a preposition. Okay. In no other game is a preposition. It's describing when something happened, or really, since this is a weird sentence, it's describing when something didn't happen in no other situation. Well, what's the subject and verb? The subject is Michael Jordan. And what did Michael Jordan do? He did demonstrate a ferocious spirit. Okay. And so what I'm really doing here is how much of a ferocious spirit did Michael Jordan demonstrate in different scenarios? And the subject doing the verb is Michael Jordan. He demonstrated the ferocious competitive spirit. His performance did not. His performance did not demonstrate a competitive spirit. And that's what A says, as did his performance. That would be the subject. And the verb is did, and did stands for display or demonstrate a competitive spirit. And then it says when his performance displayed or demonstrated a competitive spirit in Game 5 of the 1997 NBA Finals. But what I want to say is that Michael Jordan demonstrated a competitive spirit in that game. And so by just leaving it as in Game 5, I'm now comparing different times when Michael Jordan demonstrated a competitive spirit. In no other game compared to in this particular game. But in both, the subject doing the verb is Michael Jordan demonstrating a competitive spirit. This is a phenomenally difficult question based off one of the hardest ones in the book. Some like 30% of people get this question right. I chose A when I did it for the first time. Okay, very, very difficult. This is not an official question. It's adapted from one of the last ones in the. It's about Halley's Comet and something like that. Halley's Comet causing a sensation. JD, if the verb is did demonstrate, it's like a weird way of saying demonstrated. Michael Jordan demonstrated a competitive spirit more in this particular game than in any other game. The structure's chaos here, but it's Michael Jordan did demonstrate a spirit. Okay, so that will be the end of the free GMAT prep hour. Thank you all for sticking around for the bonus problem. Best of luck in your studies.